This is the story of Elliot James Grant and his wife Nora Claire Bennett. They had built something together that most couples only gesture toward, a life that looked, from the outside, like the product of shared ambition and genuine partnership. Elliot had the instinct for markets and the confidence that rooms respond to. Nora had the mind that turned ideas into architecture, the kind of thinking that didn't announce itself but held everything else up. For 11 years, this division felt natural, even complementary, until the moment it became a hierarchy neither of them had agreed to. The tension between them was never loud. It was the kind that lives in the pause before someone answers a question, in the particular way a person stops finishing the other's sentences. What would unravel them was not a single betrayal, but an accumulation of small erasures, of credit, of presence, of being truly seen, until Nora understood that she had been building a house in which she was not considered a resident. The kitchen in their Brookline home had a window that faced east, and in the mornings, when the light came through at a low angle and caught the steam rising from Elliot's coffee, Nora sometimes paused at the counter and thought, "This is still beautiful, in some way I can't quite name." She didn't say this aloud. She had learned over years that naming a feeling changed it, and she preferred to hold that particular one intact. They had a routine, as long married people do, that had the quality of choreography learned so thoroughly the dancers no longer think about the steps. Elliot rose at 6:15, showered, dressed in the clothes Nora had noticed he was increasingly selecting the night before, which she understood, without saying, meant he was preparing for something he considered important. She made coffee. He drank it standing, reading from his phone. She sat at the table with hers and read physical things, the newspaper, occasionally a brief, sometimes a journal article, related to whatever she was thinking through. They spoke, not at length, but regularly and with a familiarity that could be mistaken for closeness. "The Meridian pitch is Thursday," he said one Tuesday morning, setting his mug in the sink rather than the dishwasher, a habit she had mentioned perhaps 40 times over 11 years and had decided, somewhere around year 8, to simply absorb. "I know," she said. "I sent Priya the updated framework last night." He nodded, already looking back at his phone. "Good, she mentioned it." He had not mentioned it. He had not said, "The framework you designed is what's making this pitch possible." He didn't think to, and Nora understood this was not malice. It was something almost more difficult to hold, which was that her contributions existed in Elliot's internal accounting, in a category adjacent to his own thinking, not stolen, just absorbed. Grant and Meridian Consulting had started as a shared idea sketched on a legal pad in their old apartment on Com Ave, the year Nora was completing her MBA and Elliot had just left his second firm. It was Nora who had identified the gap in ethical compliance frameworks for mid-sized tech companies, a structural insight that became the company's foundational offering. Elliot had the relationships, the presence, the appetite for the front-facing work. She had never minded this. She had minded, gradually and quietly, when the story of the company began to be told in a way that made her disappearance from it seem natural. They had dinner with Marcus and Diane Ashby that Friday. Old friends of Elliot's from his first firm, people Nora had come to like on her own terms despite having been handed them as a set. Marcus was in commercial real estate now. Diane did something in development finance, she explained differently each time, which Nora found genuinely interesting. The dinner was at a restaurant where the acoustics were bad enough that real conversation required effort, which meant everyone leaned in and spoke more honestly than they might have otherwise. "Nora, are you still doing the framework side of things at Grant?" Diane asked over the second bottle of wine. Nora smiled. "I am. It's evolved into something more proprietary than we expected." "She's being modest," Elliot said, and for a moment Nora felt something warm. Until he continued, the whole operation would fall apart without her keeping everything organized. Organized. The word settled between them at the table, though only Nora seemed to feel its weight. Diane looked at her with a flicker of something perceptive. Marcus had already turned back to Elliot. On the drive home, Elliot reached across the console and touched her hand, which rested in her lap. It was an unthinking gesture, affectionate in the way of people who still like each other without knowing quite how to say so anymore. Nora turned her hand over and held his. They drove the rest of the way in silence. She lay awake that night for an hour after he fell asleep. Not with anger, with something quieter and more difficult. The feeling of holding a question you're not ready to ask. The thing about distance, when it grows between two people who live together, is that it doesn't arrive like weather. It accumulates in dry patches, in silences that once felt comfortable and now feel like waiting, in the way one person stops reaching for the other's attention because they've learned, incrementally, that it costs something to be disappointed. October arrived, and with it a cycle of client presentations that kept Elliot traveling 3 weeks in 5. Nora had never minded his travel. She worked well in the quiet of the house, found her own rhythms, but something had shifted in the texture of his absences. He used to call in the evenings. Now he texted, brief, logistical things. Landed, dinner ran late. Call tomorrow, and then tomorrow would be its own set of logistics. She was completing what she privately thought of as the linchpin, a proprietary ethical compliance architecture she'd been developing for 2 years. The most sophisticated work of her professional life. It mapped the intersections between a company's internal decision-making culture and its stated governance policies, identified structural contradictions before they became liability events, and could, in theory, be applied across every client Grant and Meridian would ever serve. She had filed specific elements of it under her own name, quietly, 18 months prior. Not out of suspicion then. Out of professional habit, a kind of instinct for clarity about who made what. Elliot knew about the framework in broad strokes. She had described it to him over dinner several times. He had listened, asked a few questions, said, "This could be huge for us," and she had noted the particular shape of that sentence, for us, which was generous in one reading and something else in another. She called her younger sister Ruth on a Wednesday afternoon in mid-October while the light outside the study window was turning the color of weak tea. He said, "I keep everything organized," Nora said. Ruth was quiet for a moment. "What did you say?" "Nothing." I smiled. "Nora, I know. You've been knowing for 3 years," Ruth said, not unkindly. Nora looked at the window. "I think I needed to be sure what I was naming before I named it." A silence. Then Ruth, "And now?" "Now I'm sure." She didn't elaborate, and Ruth, who knew her sister, didn't push. They talked for another 20 minutes about other things. Ruth's son's school situation, their mother's hip, a book they'd both read at different times for different reasons. Nora felt, afterward, the mild relief of having said a small true thing aloud. It was 2 days later that she found the messages. Not by searching. She had picked up Elliot's phone to silence an alarm while he was in the shower, and the screen, still open, showed a thread with a name she recognized. Daniel Forsythe, their head of business development. The messages were not romantic. That would have been, in some way, simpler. What they were was a conversation about a strategic pivot. A plan to reposition Grant and Meridian's core offering, absorb Nora's framework into a new product suite, and, in the language Elliot used, clean up the IP attribution before we bring anyone external in. And then she won't push back. You know how she is. Nora stood in the kitchen with the phone in her hand and read the thread 3 times. Her coffee went cold. The shower ran. She placed the phone back on the counter precisely where she'd found it. She did not feel what she'd expected to feel, which she supposed was rage or devastation. What she felt was more like the click of a tumbler's falling into alignment, the sensation of finally having a word for something that had been living in the body without language. She went back to her study and opened the document she'd been working on for 6 weeks, a dormant clause buried within the firm's founding IP agreement that she had drafted and had Elliot sign 4 years ago during a routine contract renewal. He had signed without reading carefully. He trusted her. That part, at least, was real. The clause transferred operational control of the firm's core IP to its original architect in the event of documented ethical breach by the founding partner. She had never expected to use it. She had included it the way you include a fire extinguisher. Not because you plan to need it, but because you understand the nature of things. She waited 9 days. She is not sure, even now, why 9 specifically, only that she needed to feel entirely steady before she said anything, and steadiness came slowly. She worked. She finished 2 client reports. She had lunch with Diane Ashby on a Thursday, during which Diane said over the salads they both ordered and neither of them was really eating, "Is everything all right with you?" And Nora said, "I think so. I'm figuring something out." With Elliot? She looked at her plate. With myself. Diane nodded, slowly, in the way of someone who understood more than had been said and chose to honor the boundary. Nora was grateful for this. She told Elliot on a Sunday evening, which she chose because it was the day they had historically been most themselves. Slow, unscheduled, the week not yet pressing in. He was reading in the armchair by the fireplace. She sat on the couch with her feet tucked under her and a glass of wine she was not drinking, and she said, "I need to talk to you about the IP restructuring." He looked up with the mild alertness of someone who didn't yet know the conversation had stakes. "What about it? I saw the messages, with Daniel." The quality of his stillness changed. Not guilt, exactly, more like recalibration. She had seen this look before, in presentations, when a question came from a direction he hadn't anticipated. He was thinking about what he'd said and what she might have read. "Nora, I'm not asking you to explain them," she said. "I read them clearly. I understood them." He set the book down. It was early stage conversation. Nothing was decided. "You said I wouldn't push back," she said. "Because you know how I am." He had the grace to look away then. Toward the fireplace, though no fire was lit. "That wasn't. I was venting. You know how it is when you're talking through strategy, Elliot." Her voice was quiet, not cold. Quiet in the way that requires more control than anger does. "I'm not here to have you explain what the words meant. I know what they meant." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. He looked, in that moment, genuinely confused, not performing confusion, but experiencing the particular disorientation of a man who has underestimated someone for so long that the correction feels like a surprise. "What do you want to do?" She took a breath. "I want to separate. From the marriage and from the business arrangement you'd planned." "That's not." He stopped. Started again. "We built this together." "Yes," she said, "we did." She waited. She waited. "So why does it feel like you've already decided everything?" he asked. And there was something real in his voice now. Something cracked open. Not anger. Something that might have been, if she'd heard it earlier, easier to respond to. "Because I have," she said. "I've been deciding for a long time. I just didn't have language for it." She glanced toward the window, at the dark glass, at their 2 faint reflections in it, and for a moment something passed across her face that was hard to name. It wasn't quite directed at him. It was directed somewhere else, at something she couldn't see. "I don't know," she said softly, almost to herself. "Maybe someone should like this story or subscribe or something." Elliot looked at her. "What?" She blinked. Came back. "Nothing. Sorry." She looked at her wine glass. "I'm tired." He stared at her for a moment longer, uncertain what had just happened, and then let it pass. Because there were larger things pressing, and said, "Nora, can we at least agree not to do anything irreversible tonight?" "Of course," she said. "Tonight isn't when things become irreversible." She meant the past. He heard it as the future. Neither of them clarified. Spring came. The divorce was filed in February, quietly, without contest. And by March, they had divided what needed dividing: the house, listed and pending sale, financial accounts separated. The firm's structure, which Elliot's attorney spent several weeks trying to navigate before realizing the clause Nora had surfaced, was, as her attorney confirmed, fully enforceable, documented by Elliot's own digital communications and not reasonably challengeable without making those communications public. He did not contest it. She had not expected him to. The Grant and Meridian staff learned about the interim CEO arrangement on a Monday morning. Priya, who had worked with Nora on frameworks for 3 years and understood the shape of the firm's actual intellectual infrastructure, took the news with something close to relief. Others were surprised. One account director, a young man named Stewart who had treated Nora in the past with the particular politeness reserved for founders' wives, found a reason to stop by her new office before noon to introduce himself with a handshake that was slightly more formal than necessary. She found this neither satisfying nor amusing, only true. Elliot moved into a furnished apartment in Back Bay. He told his account that he was taking time to reconsider the company's direction. He told Marcus Ashby that Nora had changed, become someone I didn't recognize. And Marcus, who had known him for 20 years, said, "Or someone you didn't bother to recognize," and Elliot didn't call him for 3 weeks after that. He was not, to his credit, a man who avoided his own thinking. He lay awake many nights and followed threads backward through their 11 years, tugging at moments, re-examining them in new light, the meridian pitch, the dinner, the countless mornings with his phone, the word organized. He tried to remember if he had ever truly seen her. Not her competence, not her usefulness to the shared project, but her specific inner life, her frustrations held quietly, her ambition, which he had somehow read as contentment. He couldn't always distinguish, honestly, between guilt and grief. Both felt like pressure behind the sternum. He began running in the mornings, not because he thought it would fix anything, but because the body needed somewhere to put it. Nora, for her part, found the interim work absorbing in a way that surprised her, not because she doubted her capabilities, but because she had forgotten, perhaps, what it felt like to have them be the entire point. She slept better. She called Ruth more. She had dinner twice with Diane, who asked no questions she didn't want to answer and offered company without requiring anything from it. She did not think, as she'd feared she might, obsessively about Elliot. She thought about him the way you think about a period of your life that shaped you, with some tenderness, some clarity, some residue of pain that didn't require a response. She had loved him. She wasn't entirely sure he'd ever known how, but she had. One evening, she sat at the desk in what had been her study and was now, in the new apartment she'd rented in Cambridge. Her entire office, her books, her papers, the east-facing window she'd specifically chosen, and she wrote in a journal she hadn't opened in 2 years. She wrote for an hour. She didn't reread it. She closed the journal and sat in the quiet and felt the specific weight of having survived something, which is different from having won. The turning point, when it came, was not dramatic. It was a Tuesday in late April when Elliot called, the first time, not by text, and she looked at the phone and felt only, "Yes, I can answer this." He asked if they could meet. She said yes. They chose a coffee shop in Brookline near the neighborhood but not too close, a place neither of them had any history with, which felt appropriately neutral and slightly sad. He was already there when she arrived. He looked well, she thought, slightly thinner, but well. He stood when he saw her come in, which he'd always done, and she appreciated that this particular habit hadn't changed, even if she understood it differently now. They ordered coffee. They talked briefly about logistics, a piece of mail that had reached him addressed to her, a joint account they both overlooked. Then they sat with their cups in the ambient sound of the cafe and the late afternoon light coming through the plate glass. And Elliot said, "I've been trying to understand when it went wrong." Nora looked at her coffee. "I don't think it went wrong at a specific point." "Then when did you start planning?" "I didn't plan," she said. "I protected myself. There's a difference." He considered this, the clause. "Yes, you really put that in without knowing." "Without knowing I'd need it? Yes." She looked up at him. "I was being professionally careful. Not strategic. Not vengeful. I just understood that agreements should be clear." He nodded slowly, and she could see him reassembling something, his own story about what had happened, which he'd been building in one shape and was now having to rebuild in another. "Was there anything I could have done to keep me?" she asked, and he nodded. She took a moment. "Probably, for a long time, yes." She paused. "But I don't know if you wanted to do those things." and wanting to matters. He looked at his hands around the cup. Outside, a bus passed and its shadow crossed the window. I think I thought love was something you establish, he said, like a foundation, and once it's there, it doesn't need tending. A lot of people think that, she said. Is that how it happened with you? Did you just stop feeling it? She shook her head. It's more that I stopped being the kind of person who believed the feeling was enough. She pressed her fingers around her cup. Feeling something and having it matter are different things. He didn't argue with this. She respected that. They finished their coffee. He paid, she let him, not as a concession, but because it was a small thing and there was no longer any reason to manage small things carefully. Outside the cafe, on the sidewalk, the late April air was cool but forgiving, the kind that hints at what's coming without insisting on it. Are you all right? He asked, not performing concern, actually asking. Yes, she said. I am. She meant it. Are you happy? She thought about the east-facing window in Cambridge, the journal she'd written in for an hour, the moment last week when she'd sat in the conference room at Grant and Meridian and explained a framework she'd built to a room of people who were writing things down and had felt not vindicated, nothing so loud, but accurate, like something that had been slightly misaligned had finally settled into its correct position. I think I'm becoming it, she said. He nodded. He looked at her for a moment, with something in his face she couldn't fully interpret. It wasn't regret. Or not only that, and it wasn't admiration exactly, though it carried some quality of that. It was something older and harder, recognition. The specific ache of seeing someone clearly, only once they're no longer yours to see. Take care of yourself, Elliot, she said. You too, he said. She turned and walked in the direction of the Cambridge train. She didn't look back, not because she was making a point, but because she was already thinking about other things. The brief she needed to finish, the call with Ruth tomorrow, the book she'd started and kept meaning to return to, small and real in hers. Behind her, Elliot stood on the sidewalk for a moment longer than was necessary. Long enough to watch her go. He had stood in rooms for 20 years and commanded attention, had read markets and people, and made decisions that other people trusted. He had built something real. He knew this. He also knew, and this was the thing he would carry forward, the thing that would not harden into a lesson, but would remain tender for longer than he expected, that he had lived for 11 years next to a particular intelligence, a particular kind of loyalty and depth, and had called it organized and moved on, and not understood what he'd been given until it was no longer there to ignore. He turned up his collar and walked back to his car. The city went on around him, unhurried and indifferent, the way cities always do, not cruel, not kind, just continuous, just the next moment following the last. She had not walked away with nothing. She had walked away with what had always been hers, which turned out to be more than either of them had ever said aloud.